Hi, welcome back to Jules's Archive. Today I'm going to talk about the books that I read in November. I finished 4 books this month, and there's a real mix-up of books that I really enjoyed and books I didn't, so I'm excited to talk about them. The first one I read at the start of the month was Elektra by Jennifer Saint, which follows 3 women in ancient Greece, women that are covered, namely the Trojan War. The story follows the majority of the lives of 3 characters. First one being Clytemnestra, who's a Spartan warrior and who marries Agamemnon, who is notably the leader of the Greeks in the Trojan War. Follows Elektra, who is Clytemnestra and Agamemnon's second daughter, and then Cassandra, who's a princess of Troy. The book is named after Elektra, which makes sense by the end, but isn't the focal point of the story. The story follows all 3 women in the years leading up to the Trojan War, throughout the Trojan War, and then the events immediately following. But I would say, if anything, it is more closely Clytemnestra and Cassandra's story, and then Elektra's towards the end. The prose in this is beautiful. I've been drawn to Jennifer Saint because she's been compared to Madeline Miller, and I love The Song of Achilles and still need to read Circe. So I thought I would like the writing style, and it is beautiful. I really enjoy how it's modern writing, but also feels very atmospheric and immersive. The book is structured by different parts between key events leading up to, during, and after the Trojan War, and I enjoy that the perspective is from these 3 women, really just the peripheral events being the war and like Agamemnon and different Greek heroes' journeys. The book is in first person, so you're very much within all 3 of the characters' heads and what they're thinking, and particularly how their lines of thought and perspectives towards different characters progresses throughout the war. And the Greek gods are much more of a focus, namely Apollo and his relationship with Cassandra, but from Clytemnestra and Elektra, they aren't really present. But I did enjoy the historical and cultural context that provides, being that these are all people from Greek myths. I will say I did get kind of bored during the middle of the Trojan War, but I think that has to do with more of me reading a different novel before this one, Clytemnestra by Costanzi Casati, which I talked about in previous videos. More than anything, I think it has to do with just reading that most recently. But by the end, particularly the events that follow the Trojan War that aren't covered in Clytemnestra, I was really locked in, and I was really gripped by Elektra and Clytemnestra's interactions. So overall, I really enjoyed this book. I think the prose is what stood out to me. It was very poetic, beautiful, well structured, and I gave this a 3.75. I didn't think it was like the most impactful Greek imagining novel I've read, but I did enjoy it a lot. So I would definitely recommend Elektra by Jennifer Saint if you are looking for Greek imagining from different perspectives, and really being able to be in some female characters' heads. I got Elektra from Brookline Booksmith in Boston. The second book I read was 107 Days, which is Kamala Harris's memoir, covering her experiences on the campaign trail for the 2024 presidential election. And I do have a separate video where I vlogged my entire time reading this book, so I won't dive into really the details of the events, but essentially the book opens up with Harris receiving a call from Biden telling her that he's going to drop out of the race and asking her to step in as the new Democratic candidate. And then that starts at 107 days until the election day. Every chapter, give or take, is a day on the campaign trail, which works really well to show how much Harris accomplishes and strives towards in the different challenges day to day. This book didn't have that much of an impact for me. Really, it's just describing how she was feeling and the more external and internal forces at play throughout the campaign. But other than that, it really isn't all enlightening. It is really what you would expect. It's more just behind the scenes from her perspective and a tell-all on what was happening. But I think if you go into reading this memoir already liking Harris, you'll leave it liking Harris, and if you dislike her, you probably also leave disliking her. I don't think it really has much sway either way. I will say I think the end of the book is most interesting, where she talks about the immediate aftermath after the election. She has some commentary on the direction America is going, so I think that is probably the most interesting part. But Other than that, it's really just her perspective. I think, you know, to garner some empathy for this very short campaign where you could argue a lot of things were against her. In the book, there's also some like pretty cool images. There's also like the middle part where it has some photos from throughout the campaign. I think it was beneficial for me because I like followed the campaign with most Americans but wasn't like super close to it. I kind of saw all the like cultural events with like Kamala's brat and all the branding they did to kind of attract Gen Z. Wasn't following like the debate super closely, so getting her perspective on that was interesting, but that's kind of all I would land it, is like mildly interesting. I gave this a solid just like 3 stars. I didn't leave for having really like much to think on after this, but I would say again the afterword is honestly the most food for thought that this book provides. I got 107 Days by Kamala Harris at Noe Valley Books in San Francisco. Okay, and then third one I read is this behemoth, Katabasis or Katabasis depending on how you want to say it, by R.F. Kuang. Okay, so I will say I know that a lot of people have really strong thoughts swaying positive and negative for R.F. Kuang, and I kind of land in the middle. I have read Yellowface, which I generally enjoyed, had my qualms with it, namely in that it was a little bit like too simplistic of a satirical novel for me, and also I think undermined the reader's intelligence and like ability to infer meaning from the story. And then I read The Poppy War, which has like all the ingredients of something I would like, a epic fantasy book that is kind of like a mythological based retelling in history, with a strong female character. Like those are all the ingredients I would like in an epic fantasy book, but it just didn't really have an impact on me. Like I enjoyed the part where she was in the academy, and then after that I just didn't care. And that's kind of similar to how I felt about Katabasis. So we're reading this book for my book club, so if you're in my book club, maybe don't watch this section, skip to the next book. And I'm excited to talk about this with everybody because I will say this is a great book club book. It yields a lot of discussion. It's also pretty hefty. There's a lot that goes on. And I think people have very strong opinions, so it is going to be a fun one to talk about. It's like I had a decent enough time. So Katabasis follows 2 grad students, Alice Law and Peter Murdoch, who are PhD students in analytical magic at Cambridge. They're journeying through hell to find their advisor, Professor Grimes, so that they can graduate from their program. And the way I felt about this book was pretty similar to how I felt about The Poppy War, where I generally enjoyed myself. I didn't really care about what they were doing in hell. I was really more interested in the sections where Alice describes her experience at Cambridge, honestly, because there's just more commentary on academia, more on her relationship with different students, namely Peter Murdoch, who shares her advisor, Professor Grimes, and also her experiences with Grimes throughout the program, and also her journey leading up to her time at Cambridge. Like, I generally enjoyed that, but I didn't care about what they were doing in hell. And I think partially that's because they journeyed through like 8 courts of hell, and the first like 3 or 4 courts were just described so blandly. I guess you could say this is a little bit of a spoiler, but the first few courts resemble Cambridge University or just like a university campus more generally, and I just thought that was so boring. Like, there's so many cool ways that you could describe hell atmospherically, and I just didn't care for the way that they were described the first half, but then I think the second half is a lot more interesting. There's also all these kind of different random characters that have some connection to the field of analytical magic that they meet, but really none of it is of consequence, and I think events are different, or like weirdly timed. Like, they could have happened a little bit later and had way more of an impact, but because of the time that they happened in the story, I just didn't give a shit. I just didn't think it had any impact. There's also a romance between the first 2 characters, kind of a slow burn enemies to lovers romance with some shared history between 2 characters, Alice and Peter. And I just kind of knew where it was going. It was very predictable the entire time. Obviously, we were going to learn a little bit more about their background, like why they had a bit of a falling out, why they hate each other so much. So it just had no impact for me. There are also different chapters, mainly towards the beginning, where they're like on magic and they explain some aspect of the magic system. I think a good fantasy writer demonstrates the magic system and its mechanics of it by showing through the story and its events and actions rather than telling. I understand that it's because this is academia, so it really like leans into like academic language, and these like on magic chapters kind of fit into that, but I just really didn't enjoy them. They didn't add anything that kind of took me out of the story. And also the magic doesn't really make sense. Like I kind of at some point was just like, I have to suspend my disbelief and just kind of like focus on the story. But I had a hard time like staying in this book. I gave it like 2.5 because by the time I got to kind of like the climax of the book, I really didn't care. I was just waiting for it to end, and then it's not a book I've thought about since. I also got Katabasis by Kuang and Noe Valley Books. Following Katabasis, I really needed a book that was going to make me think, that was going to be a good time, because I could just feel with Katabasis, being that's like a 500 something page book, I was gonna hit a reading slump if I didn't read something that I liked. So the next book that I read is Strangers to Ourselves, Unsettled Minds, and the Stories That Make Us by Rachel Aviv, which is a book unlike anything else I've ever read before. It covers mental illness, but really from the stories of 5 or 6 different people. The book starts off with a prologue that is actually the author's. Rachel Aviv is a journalist who covers health issues, namely like mental health and the field of psychology and medicine. And the prologue in the book is her story grappling with what is diagnosed as anorexia as a 6-year-old, and her time in a hospital and the people she meets and how her disease is talked about. And then there's 4 other stories that cover different people grappling with different mental illnesses very extremely in intersection with other like external internal forces. Epilogue covers the story of someone that the author herself, Aviv, met her time in the hospital, so it kind of ties together all these stories really nicely. I will say when I read the prologue, I was intrigued. I was enjoying kind of like the memoir like narrative, and there's a lot of research in this book, but it's accessibly written and really interweaved within the stories themselves. So you're kind of reading about a real person and the real life story, but you're hearing from like family members, their own journals and medical records, their medical providers, therapists, etc. But also historical context from the field of pediatrics, psychology, medicine, from the time that they lived and like forces before that. I didn't really care for the second story that covered a man named Ray, but then the next 3 stories I really enjoyed. The third one is from a woman from India named Bapu, and it covers her journey with mental illness, but really the effects of like colonialism in India. The next story covers a black single woman named Naomi. It covers like her experience with schizophrenia, but most history in America of extreme anti-black racism and also the effects of like incarceration, particularly on POCs in America, and also like a history of mental illness and how that is often minimized within Black women and families. Hello, Editing Jules here. In watching myself talk about Naomi's story, I didn't really capture what made it so compelling and heartbreaking. So I just wanted to clarify here. So essentially, Naomi's section opens up with her walking through a 4th of July parade with her 2, just over a year, old twins. And she's struggling a lot with what was later identified as postpartum depression, and also struggling with thoughts of like systemic racism and how she can never escape that and her children will never escape that. And she gets to the point where you could call it mania, where she kind of dissociates from her body and mind, where she drops her 2 14-month-old children off a bridge and then herself. She is saved and both of her children are attempted to be rescued. One of them makes it and another one dies. So she is eventually charged with 2nd-degree murder. And all this context is really important because she's unable to make a case for insanity despite her not really being aware of what action she was taking, and there being a lot of context for that. And then in her time in jail, she works on rehabilitation throughout a decade and helps a lot of other women through jail. Her case is also not approached in the same way that white women are historically through her specific prison. So that's the impetus of her section in the book, and there's a ton of detail in there. And I learned a lot about, you know, the entrenched history of slavery that we typically think of like in the South, but, you know, has impacts in our legal system and just how we view Black people and Black women. And then this all intertwined with mental illness is really heartbreaking, but really thought-provoking. So the story was by far my favorite in terms of opening up my mind and just thinking critically about like different cases of incarcerated people, you know, and kind of the generational background. The next story covers a girl who's diagnosed with depression at a young age and put on SSRIs, depression medication, from a young age, but then when she tries to go off the medication, has extreme withdrawal, and also doesn't know like her kind of center, given that she's been on medication from a very young age, and that's kind of her journey. What I really enjoyed about this book is it's much less of a focus on the specific mental illnesses and really more kind of the historical and cultural, political, economic forces behind them. And there's a big emphasis on the historical context of these individual stories intertwined with their family and the medical system and field of psychology and psychiatrics evolves throughout time for better and for worse. And it's really well researched, but presented in an easy to read, concise, accessible way. There are a few points that feel like just the author's, Aviv's perspective, because she interviews all of these people and learns about their stories directly as well as through other sources. So I will say there are some versions that are presented kind of as fact, but I think are more her opinion. So you kind of have to parse through that in this book. But overall, I really enjoyed it. I love books that make me critically think about a topic that I'd never been encouraged to explore before. And I think medication and mental illness is something that I've always been curious about and heard different people's perspectives on, but had never dug into that deep, and I thought this was really a great entry point for that. So I would strongly encourage Strangers to Ourselves by Rachel Aviv. I gave it 4.5 stars. I didn't think it was perfectly presented, but overall super impactful, if a little bit uneven. That's probably going to be one of my favorites of the year. And then Strangers to Ourselves I got from Books Inc. in San Francisco. Those are all 4 of the books that I read and finished this past November. I also started reading If It Makes You Happy by Olivia, which I'd heard of a lot online as just like a very fall atmospheric romance, and I did my usual test of reading 50 pages and then seeing if I liked it, and I just couldn't care. Like, I really liked some of the side characters in that book, but did not care at all about the main couple. I thought the female main character was like insufferable to the point of the book not being enjoyable. The main male character was just a lot better, and I didn't really care about where their romance was going to go. So I DNF'd that book. If It Makes You Happy, I borrowed from San Francisco Public Library. Those are all the books I read in November. Overall, it was a very mixed bag. I did find a new favorite. If you've read any of these books or if any of them sound interesting, I'd love to chat about them in the comments down below. In the meantime, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell to be notified when I upload a new video. Thanks for watching. See you next time.